The title of tonight's talk is Linear Societies and Nonlinear Drugs, which is something that I just had to pull out of the air when Ken finally slammed me to the wall for what I would be talking about this night many months ago. But more and more for me, especially with this group, these things have become sort of summations and, I guess I hope, convivial examinations of just where we are, we, each and every one of us, and then this enterprise, whatever we mean by that, in the context of everything else that's happening in the world. In other words, the psychedelic experience, the entheogenic experience, contextualized. And as I try to think about, what, if anything, I can bring to the party, I guess it's that what I'm interested in is psychedelics as a philosophical tool. And when I concretized that for myself, I realized there's no claims on that part of discourse. No one wants to do this. Academic philosophy is done in a very formal manner, and the most exciting is incredibly stuffy. And yet, I, like most of you, I assume, have taken on board in my life this thing called the psychedelic experience, which is then as large a portion of my being as my sexuality, my politics, my education. It shapes everything. And yet nowhere in the world of philosophical discourse is there any genuflection, at least overtly, made to this. I mean, maybe not since Plato. We talked about shadows on the wall of a cave and so forth and so on. Well, so what can psychedelics and the psychedelic experience bring to philosophy? And what do I mean by philosophy? By philosophy I mean the enterprise of discursive thinking, trying to understand what the world is and who's asking the question. Where did the world come from? Where is it bound? And who's along for the ride? It seems to me that we, as a community, have, this is sort of hard to wrap your mind around, at least for me, but we have, in a sense, inculcated into ourselves the image of an underclass, so that we struggle for legal toleration of our practices and our habits, but we don't struggle for intellectual legitimation of our visions. We accept that they are somehow contextually marginal. And as I thought about that, I realized that is a limitation on the community. That the information which is coming from the psychedelic experience as interpreted by Western people is primary evidence for the need for a major paradigm shift in the whole way the Western mentality does business. Well, what kind of evidence and what kind of shift? Well, there's a lot of talk in our community, and there has been for many, many years, about shamanism. And when we seek to legitimize ourselves through a historical argument, we reach back to shamanism and we say, we're part of something which is 100,000 years old and worldwide and touched the spirit long before the shadow of the cross fell over Jerusalem, and so forth and so on. All true. and in a way that has, I think, that tendency, which is part of the broader tendency in the Western mind to valorize and grow nostalgic over the primitive, has put a certain political cast on our stance and our position. But what we are is, again contextually, is a culture of science. And I'm speaking now of our community. It's the Albert Hoffmans and the Dave Nichols and the Sasha Shulgins who have kept our canoe afloat. These are men of science. Its methods, its vocabulary, its culture. We have not, though we certainly honor those people and love them, as their rhetoric is not the primary rhetoric of the larger community of psychedelic users, which tends toward this, as I refer to it, this shamanistic aboriginal nostalgia. Turn left here for a moment and say, I feel more comfortable with the scientific end of things. I think the news coming out of science is the most psychedelic news there is. When I go to the internet, I go to things like Science Alert and the Hubble Picture of the Day and this sort of thing. And our community as a whole, I think, is not involved enough in incorporating the vistas. If, while we struggle to legalize psychedelics, psychedelic thinking is everywhere triumphant, because the instruments built by linear science throw open doorways on the unimaginable, and the most revered and hoary hefes of the scientific establishment have to genuflect before this stuff. I mean, what am I talking about? Well, for example, Science magazine wrote last week that the most important scientific breakthrough of 1998 was the apparent observation and agreement upon that observation by the astrophysical community of a cosmological constant. This sounds like very deep physics, but if I give it to you as a headline, what it means is the entire universe, every atom and every empty space of it, is ruled by a very weird force that has now been seriously known to science for precisely 5 months. A force which is apparently going to overcome gravity's tendency to collapse the universe and to cause it to expand in a very explosive and counterintuitive and psychedelic fashion that is the complete confoundment of the core science that Western linear thinking has built. And of course there weren't riots in the streets and the electricity didn't fail, but at the very pinnacles of the antenna of the evolving civilization, there was a shudder felt in the force, you may be sure. There are two much larger forces than our community that are in play in terms of shaping the cultural modality, and I would call them, what would I call them? Well, I would call one of them science. It's the other one that I'm having trouble with. It is everything which is not anchored in the rational. You know, the 20th century is the most spectacularly celebratory, has the most spectacular celebratory affair with the irrational since the 16th century. I mean, never before have so many prophets, wizards, wise women, casters of runes, and seers of visions moved among the people, plying their wares. And part of this is brought on by the tension between the failure of the education system at the very moment of an inflationary expansion of knowledge, so that it's very hard to be au courant in all fields. And if you're not current in a field, then probably your version of that field is some kind of story, a myth. I mean, if you can't keep up with quantum physics, why not fall back on archangels? It requires less intellectual engagement or something like that. Discourse is fragmenting. Fields of discourse are evolving vocabularies so rapidly that the understanding of these vocabularies is not penetrating very far beyond the core group of workers. So then this is creating kind of islanded systems of self-reference, where outside those systems of self-reference, information doesn't travel. The people who are the gene splicers know very little about remote sensing, and both of those parties know very little about recent discoveries in astrophysics, for example. So there's an intellectual fragmentation. I live in Hawaii and in a forest in fairly remote conditions, and so I entertain all this in my mind all the time and try to, my faith, and I assume it's the psychedelic faith, although we've had some fairly existential characters in our ranks over the years. But the psychedelic faith, I think, is that the universe is beautiful in the Platonic sense, and therefore good and true. In other words, we're optimists. We're not flailing existentialists. We're not relativists, because we have a real standard to measure our spiritual coinage against. So we're not relativists. This is a point I'm really keen to make, because we're embedded in relativism. It's all around us. It's the air we breathe. But it is not inimical to the psychedelic community. I mean, I think the psychedelic experience is the only authentic source of reliable contact with the numinous. I mean, meditation and so forth and so on is all very fine, but it requires a leisure class involved in philanthropic support of this kind of foolishness, where the psychedelic experience is immediate and real. Somebody once told me if the Earth completely disappeared except for its nematodes, that you could still see the outlines of the continents if you were standing on the moon. I thought, now just who gathered this factoid? So then, to bring this back around a little, where is the psychedelic experience in all of this? Well, it used to be called, or at one phase it was called, consciousness expansion. And consciousness expansion in human beings is going to become an absolute necessity, because we are summoning out of the woodwork of cybernetic technology machines that are going to require super intelligent humans to direct and have discourse with them. This is happening. It is already happening. I mean, the internet is this. I mean, it doesn't tap you on the shoulder and remind you to brush your teeth, but it is, a partner in the understanding of the world that is genie-like. That's the image I have when I sit down to it. It is all John Dee would have asked of his archangelic messengers. He wanted instantaneous information on the political situation in the courts of Europe. He wanted information on the course of the Drake's expedition, then on the other side of the planet. The internet is this kind of magical, intelligent prosthesis. And as I said, there won't come a dramatic moment, I think, a la Lawnmower Man or something like that. These things are much more seeping. The only people who in fact can see the game move against the background of the forest pattern are psychedelic heads. You have to think about this stuff, and you have to develop vocabularies for catching it in action. This is what the game of being an intellectual is, I think. Trying to see the process of morphological unfoldment in action and guess the direction in which it's headed. Because it's inevitably headed toward greater density of information at greater speeds, higher level integrative metaphors, visually rather than textually displayed, transformation of such graphic and glyphic elements over time, it becomes more and more like the interface of a computer, more and more like some kind of machine environment. I mean, we have thought for, I assume, at least 100,000 years, maybe much longer. But the quality of thought, it was early. When it was early, it was intermittent. It was thin. It was a groping. It was an undigested intuition, a perception slipping away from the mind's eye because of media reinforcement and education and acculturation and the passage of the 100,000 years. The voice of the mind, the logos, has grown stronger, but now it takes an exponential leap forward into visualization, into manifestation through this information processing prosthesis that integrates us all